So in the last module, we talked about federal lists and provincial lists and concurrent lists and how different constitutions divide power between the federal government and the provincial government, because we wanted to know who are the people that are making the social policy in Pakistan. So who are the decision makers? So we looked at what the constitution says about it. Let's look what actually happened. So yes, powers were divided between federal and provincial governments, but even the powers that were given to explicitly given by the constitution to the provinces were exercised by the federal government. So this has been the case for the last 60 years before the 2010 amendment, 18th amendment. So health, education, local government, law and order, which have always been provincial subjects in all constitutions, were primarily exercised by the federal government. The federal government controlled these, even when the constitution explicitly gives these powers, these areas, to the provincial government to legislate. So all the policies, health, education, should have been made by the provincial government, but it was not the case. So there were, you look at the history of Pakistan, and we will look in some of the next modules that there are many different education policies coming from the federal government. Then you look at the local government legislation. So if you look at the local government legislation before the 2010 18th amendment, they have always come from the federal government. So there is the basic democracies legislation in the 1959 coming from the federal government to both the wings, East Pakistan and West Pakistan. Then there is the 1979 Local Government Act by General Ziaul Haq, again a federal law implemented across Pakistan in all the provinces. And then of course there was this the devolution by General Musharraf in 2001, established Nazmeen and all that. This was also a federal act, and it was the provinces were forced to accept it. Similarly, there are health policies coming from the federal government, and the provinces accept it. Even when it is the constitution gives the right to the provinces to make these policies. And this is happening, both in case of martial law governments and democratic governments. So in case of martial law, it's more stark, it's more clear that who is making decisions. But even in case of democratic governments, it's the federal governments who are powerful and who are making the decisions regarding different social policies. So if you look at the martial laws under Ayub, after he unconstitutionally, there is the coup d'etat in 1958, he established 33 commissions. So these commissions were related to all different kind of activities. So related to agriculture, related to education, health, industry, law, police, finance, constitution, all these. And many of these subjects were not in the domain of federal government, or for example, education, agriculture, law and order, all these are provincial subjects. But the commissions were made, and the policy they gave were implemented as policies and laws and rules and regulations. Similarly, under General Musharraf, we have this National Reconstruction Bureau, which is the NRB. And NRB gave us, interfered with provincial powers in many areas. It gave a new law of police. It gave the devolution law. It came up with law with policies related to health, education, and other areas. Again, most of them are provincial subjects, but the policies were made by the federal government for the provinces, which was, of course, unconstitutional. And most who were part of these bureaus and commissions which are established under Ayub Khan or Musharraf or Ziaul, mostly they were generals, bureaucrats. So of course there is a federal bias. So most of them were in federal service, whether they were in military or whether they were in civil bureaucracy. They were part of the federal. So they were not representatives of provinces. They were not much linked with the people. Mostly were men, mostly were Muslim, mostly were educated, and mostly were from Punjab. So smaller provinces felt that their voice was unheard in case of martial laws, because it's the civil military bureaucracy. Both these bureaucracy, Punjabis dominate, and so of course this leads to resentment in smaller provinces, because according to Constitution, these policies have to be made by the provinces themselves. Federal government doesn't have the power to do that. Under democratic governments too, similar things happened, perhaps less frequently, but still the federal government dominated and tried to make policies for the provincial governments, which were of course unconstitutional. So social policies were made in Islamabad and then changed in Islamabad in case of Pakistan.